Hello, my name is Charles Cowap, and I've been working with the Jahama Highland Estate over the last year on a broad-ranging appraisal of the natural capital assets on the estate. More of that later on, but in this presentation I want to talk about the work that we have been doing on the carbon values of the estate. Let's start with a little background about the estate itself. The Jahama Highland Estate is owned by the Gupta Family Group, or GFG Alliance. That's an alliance of several companies, but they include in particular Liberty Steel, Alvance Aluminium and Cymec Renewable Energy. This group has committed itself to carbon neutral steel and aluminium production by 2030 and is particularly promoting its green steel and green aluminium initiatives. The estate itself extends to 461 square kilometres. That's 114,000 acres, or 46,100 hectares. By any measure, it is a large and considerable estate. The estate really came into being with the merger of three estates during the 20th century. Work first started in the early 1900s on the construction of the hydroelectric power plant and the dam at Kinloch Leven. The village there was built and extended to accommodate the workers for this massive project. It was the first village in the world to be fully electrified, earning itself the name the Electric Village. All this effort was towards the end of smelting aluminium, producing aluminium from bauxite. The purpose of the hydroelectric installation was to power the arc furnaces, which provide the energy for this very energy-intensive process. Work continued later in the 20th century with the development of the smelter at Fort William. Not only this involved the construction of another hydroelectric plant in the smelter itself, but the construction of a very considerable system of tunnels which joined together rivers and lochs to bring the water to the slopes of Ben Nevis itself, from where it falls down to power the aluminium smelter itself. The smelter at Fort William is still in production to this day and is in fact the last aluminium smelter in the United Kingdom. Kinloch Leven is still producing electricity and it is now fed into the national grid for general consumption. You'll get some idea of the appearance of the estate from the pictures on these slides, because they have all been chosen to represent different views on the estate, and indeed they were all taken by people who work in numerous different roles on the estate. What else is on the estate? In many ways it's representative of a good many traditional Highland estates. It has extensive woodlands, lots of biodiversity and habitat, and of course wildlife management is a key activity on the estate. Most obviously this would be through the management of the deer herds which wander freely over the area. But less obviously there are also some very rare species to be found on the estate, in such abundance in fact that the estate has been able to donate golden eagle chicks to restoration projects elsewhere in Scotland. There are a number of bothies, rudimentary shelters for walkers and climbers scattered across the estate. There are commercial ski runs on the lower slopes of Ben Nevis. There are trails for mountain bikes and walkers, and kayak runs through the many rivers and waterways that bisect the estate. And of course there are a number of let properties and other diversified enterprises, including a specialised butchery opened in the last year or so, selling venison related products. 2 long distance paths traverse the estate. The estate surrounds Ben Nevis, that most iconic mountain in the Scottish landscape. The mountain itself is largely owned by the John Muir Trust, but the estate does run up to and include the cliffs on the north face of Ben Nevis, a very popular and challenging climbing venue all year round. So much then for a broad view of the background to the estate. Now let's have a look at the work that we have been doing on its carbon sequestration values. To start with, we needed to identify different areas of land use on this extensive estate. The areas that we were interested in are the better quality peatland, the woodland and the grassland. We therefore isolated the Class 1 and Class 2 peatland areas from the published peatland maps of Scotland, 14,200 hectares of those. There's another 4,100 or so hectares of woodland and just over 12,800 hectares of grassland. That means we were working with a total land area of 31,000 plus hectares. That leaves quite a large part of the estate unaccounted for, about 15,000 hectares. Why didn't we include that? Well, that's covered by water, bare rock, lower grade peat, which we need to examine the potential for restoration for. In other words, that's not going to be making any contribution yet to the carbon value of the estate. We therefore stuck with our 31,000 hectares or so. So much for the areas of land use. What we had to do then was to look at the sequestration potential of those areas. Sequestration is still a developing science. There is a lot more groundwork to be done before we can be fully confident of suitable sequestration rates to adopt in different situations. So, accepting the developing state of the science behind these data, accepting that this was a strategic study, we decided that it would be best to take a fairly cautious approach within the available figures. Starting with peatland, reported rates of sequestration for functioning Class 1 and Class 2 peat run from about 2 to 4 tonnes per hectare per year. The Office for National Statistics adopts a figure of just a little over 3.5 tonnes for the purpose of the national statistical accounts of nature. We decided to run with that figure for our Class 1 and 2 peat on the estate. However, there's an important caveat that we need to add about the sequestration behaviour of peatland. Settled peat bog, which is in a good condition, may in some years be sequestering, it may in other years be emitting carbon dioxide. The real benefits of peatland management for carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas removal lies in the restoration of damaged peat, because peat is an enormous repository of stored carbon. And once that peat starts to deteriorate, that carbon is released to the atmosphere. So for our study, we focused on the peatland which we understand to be in better condition. There's another story to return to in due course about peat which will benefit from restoration work. Turning to woodland, the reported rates of sequestration lie in the range 50 to 20 tonnes per hectare per year. We chose fairly cautiously within this range and adopted a figure of 10 tonnes per annum per year. And that leaves the grassland. This is an area where the science is perhaps at its least developed out of the three areas we've looked at. But we found reported rates of anything from less than 0, that is to say that grassland is emitting carbon, to rates higher than 8 tonnes a hectare a year. We found some more specific studies that had been undertaken in Scotland, which proposed ranges of 0 to 900 kilograms per hectare per year. We, cautiously we think, adopted the middle of that range of 450 kilograms per hectare per year. So now we had to tie in these sequestration rates with the land areas that we had adopted. The table on this slide shows how we did that. You can see our three main land uses in the first column. You can see the areas that we adopted in the second column. And taking our ranges, you can see some minimum and maximum figures. But the rate that we adopted is shown in the penultimate column. And there you can see that peatland, woodland and grassland come to a total of about 112,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide being sequestered every single year. That compares very well indeed with the figure reported for the aluminium smelter itself under the European Union's emission trading scheme in 2019, which was total emissions of 64,000 tonnes per year. I want to stress here the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon, because of course carbon dioxide is a compound of carbon and oxygen, and the final column on my slide here shows the equivalent values of carbon to the sequestration rates we've adopted. But the figures that we need to concentrate on for now are those that have now been put inside the red boundary. 112,000 tonnes of CO2 a year compared with emissions from the smelter of 64,000 tonnes. But this is an unfair comparison because so far we have only looked at carbon dioxide. We must go on to look at some of the other greenhouse gases. Carbon is not the whole story. Peatland, for example, particularly when it is being restored, emits quite large quantities of methane and nitrous oxide. They are both greenhouse gases. We shall see how they compare with carbon dioxide in a moment. They are more potent in many ways in their short-term effects than carbon dioxide, although they tend to be somewhat less long-lived in the atmosphere. If we allow for the carbon dioxide equivalents of the methane and nitrous oxide, our figure from the previous slide of 112,000 tonnes comes down to about 62 to 64,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. Still very healthily close to the figure reported for the smelter. Let's just have a look at this question of carbon dioxide equivalents, because we've already seen that we have a measure of carbon, we have a measure of carbon dioxide, and now I've introduced carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e. Here are the three greenhouse gases and one other which I've mentioned. You can see their chemical formula there. These are compared very often in terms of their 100-year global warming potential, and if carbon dioxide has a potential of 1 over 100 years, methane is 25 times as bad, and nitrous oxide is 298 times as bad. There are a number of other greenhouse gases which I haven't shown on this table because they're of little concern in land management. They're mainly industrial gases used in refrigeration. But just by way of comparison, look at sulfur hexafluoride. That's a gas which is used in the electricity industry where it's valued for its insulation properties. Next time you're looking at a substation, watch out for the danger warning signs for SF6 on the doorway. That's because it's a gas which is heavier than air and can lead to asphyxiation if you find yourself in a below ground chamber which is full of it. It used to be used, incredibly, to give tennis balls their bounce, and indeed to give one major brand of trainers their bounce. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore. But you can see here that this really draws out this question of CO2 equivalents, and that is why in adjusting the peatland figures in our study for the methane and nitrous oxide emission, we have brought the net sequestration rates down to very low levels indeed. What is all this worth? It may seem invidious to start putting values on things like global warming, but it's a growing discipline and one which is fully supported by the government. The government, for example, publishes figures which are official estimates of the cost of dealing with the damage caused by excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. And these are target specific figures which are aimed at our global warming targets. So if we look at the value of the damage which is being avoided by the mid-range of these figures, we come to a figure of £1.3 million a year. No mean sum. We can capitalise these figures over any period we want, but taking the figure over 50 years, for example, the benefit in today's values is £195 million for this rate of sequestration over the next 50 years. And of course there is already carbon stored in the peatland and the soil and the timber reserves on the estate. I've shown the dangers of this in relation to the peatland, that if you let these reserves deteriorate, you are releasing this carbon into the atmosphere and adding to the problem of global warming. It's therefore really important that we manage these assets to make sure that these reserves are protected and enhanced. I must now turn to some limitations of our project. This has been a desktop study. That's been dictated by the size of the estate and also the fact that we have been doing this work during the COVID pandemic, where our ability to undertake real field work has been severely limited. I should emphasise that the carbon values I've quoted are government official figures for averting the damage from carbon. They're not market values of the carbon that we have estimated. In fact, carbon market values tend to lag somewhat behind the government official figures. We've also looked at the sequestration value of the estate, but we have only just now started to work on carbon footprinting activity. It is only when we have done that that we will be able to compile a more complete carbon account for the estate. That's a work in progress. The most important limitation I must emphasise, though, is that we have described business as usual. And business as usual is not going to solve the problems of global warming. We all have to examine our business approaches and see what we can do to change from business as usual to reducing the amount of carbon that all our activities are releasing into the atmosphere. Nevertheless, establishing the baseline is a really important first step. And establishing the value of the asset that you have enables you to bring a proper focus on protecting and enhancing that asset. That's the importance of the work that we have been doing on the Jahama Highland Estate, and we fully accept that it is subject to that limitation. So what comes next? We need to carry on refining our work. We have started work on carbon footprinting the main estate management activities, starting with the farming activities on the estate. We want to share and review our work so that it is widely known, so that we get the benefit of accumulated wisdom and insight as feedback onto what we have been doing. We want to explore the potential under the peatland carbon code to fully recognise the work that we have been doing on the estate, and we want to look at our lower grade areas of peat to ascertain where there may be other areas where we can enhance the existing condition of the existing peatland reserves. And I said at the start that this is part of a wider natural capital study on the estate. Let's end by having a look at that broader context. Here's a sketch plan that one of the staff on the estate prepared just to summarise some of the many natural capital assets that are to be found on the Jahama estate. We chose from all these different assets to concentrate on 4 areas to begin with, once we had dealt with our peat study. So we are looking at the value of the water that flows through the estate, not only for its great value in generating electricity, but for the many other uses to which it is put as well. That even includes whiskey distilling. I've mentioned the peat already, and it has a far wider value than just its carbon sequestration. It has tremendous value for its general biodiversity and of course related recreational uses as well. But that links to our separate and distinct third theme, which is the recreational value of the estate to all those walkers, climbers, bikers and kayakers. Thank you for listening and looking at our presentation. My name's Charles Cowap, and I've been greatly assisted in this work by Julia Stoddart, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Jahama Highland Estate. If you would like to know more about the estate and the work that we have been doing, you can see some contact details on this final slide. Thank you for your attention.